All right, it's 9:55. Welcome everybody. I'm Kelly Dubé with Tetra Tech. I'm your moderator for this session. Thanks for joining us. And if you have any technical issues while the session is going, just drop a message in the chat and somebody from Tetra Tech will swoop in and try to give you a hand. Just a reminder to please mute yourself if you haven't already. And we recommend keeping your cameras off to decrease the chances we have any technical glitches. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. We'll save some time at the end to make sure that we get to everyone's questions. If you want to show our presenter for this session some feedback, feel free to use your emojis. And just a reminder that our presenter, Lauren McPhillips, is here volunteering today, and we want to thank her for her time and just remind folks that any technical approaches or technology discussed is not necessarily endorsed by EPA or DEP. We're sharing the experiences that folks have implementing programs on the ground or sharing the research that they're doing. So with that disclaimer and introduction, I want to turn it over to Lauren McPhillips, who is here with us from Penn State University to talk about green infrastructure and extreme events. So Lauren, the floor is yours. Thanks for being here with us today.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. As was noted, I'm currently at Penn State at the University Park campus. I would say I still feel relatively new, so I'm still kind of learning the lay of the land in some respects of Pennsylvania, but I'll be talking today just about generally how we might leverage green infrastructure in extreme events, what we expect to see in terms of more extreme events in Pennsylvania. I'm co-appointed across two different departments at Penn State, our civil and environmental engineering and ag and bioengineering departments, and kind of come from a mixed background myself. I consider myself more of a hydrologist as well as an ecological engineer. So I know I'm preaching to the choir on this, but just kind of reminding ourselves on where we are in terms of what we're designing our stormwater controls to. We're largely thinking in Pennsylvania about nuisance events for a lot of our sort of stormwater management. And that's because we're obviously thinking a lot about water quality and first flush. We're thinking about these events that are happening more often and are causing, some nuisance flooding. And so we're thinking about runoff reduction for things like the 2-year, 24-hour or more frequent sort of events. For peak flow rate control, we're thinking a little bit more about extreme events. We could have a whole discussion about what even constitutes an extreme event, but generally speaking, people are thinking more about something like a 100-year return period or a 1% sort of probability.
Lauren, I hate to interrupt. I'm wondering if there's any way to adjust your headphones or your speaker. We're getting a little bit of warbliness. It sounds like just kind of some ripples in the audio.
All right, one second. Let me just take off the headphones and we'll just try with the regular tablet speaker. Apologies.
I apologize for interrupting.
Okay, so let me know, is this any better?
Oh, so much better. Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. We're all dealing with, the technical difficulties in this last year, and even buying the fancy headphones doesn't always seem to work. But anyways,
this is great quality. Thank you.
So, that's what Pennsylvania is doing. How do we compare to other places? So I have, before I was in Pennsylvania, I was actually working in a position where I was, looking across cities. We were working with a bunch of cities across the US and Latin America, thinking about, what their stormwater management approaches are. What are they thinking about in terms of extreme events? And so if we look at this plot, what we see here is, for an example, sampling of cities across the United States. The circles are different peak flow management requirements, and the triangles are different volume or runoff reduction sort of requirements. And so there's a bunch that are clustered there around these lower return periods. So Pennsylvania is not really odd in what its sort of targets are. We're generally thinking about these water quality relevant nuisance more frequent events. There are a few cities that are requiring volume management at larger return periods. Miami and Portland, both thinking about 5 and 10-year return periods, and Phoenix, the oddball that gets these really intense, flashy monsoonal events, actually requiring management of the 100-year 2-hour event. So what does climate change mean here in Pennsylvania? Well, we have a really hot off the press Pennsylvania climate impacts assessment that Governor Wolf was just tweeting about yesterday. And if we just take a look at some of the basic stats statewide, I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard generally about the northeastern US, generally becoming wetter and having more intense events. That's why we're talking about this today. But it's nice to see some of the stats, and I encourage you to check out the executive summary on that. There's some nice graphics and whatnot. But we see here, when we look across the state, annual precipitation is anticipated to change from, what's currently around 43, 44 inches per year to something closer to 48, 49 inches per year. That's a little over a 10% increase. Annual max 3-day precipitation, about a 16% increase from 2.4 inches to 2.8 inches. If we look at more of these, more extreme, less frequent precipitation, what's classified in this report as very heavy, which they define as 95th percentile sort of events. We can see it obviously varies across Pennsylvania because the Southeast tends to have, greater precipitation. But if we look in central PA where we are, we do see this change from something that's more like, 15-ish days to something more like 20 to 25 days of heavier precipitation. And that means a lot. It may not seem like a big change, but when we're thinking about the impacts of that, the disruption, the impacts on infrastructure and on people, it's something that we can't really ignore. So as stormwater managers, of course, you're thinking about, your design standards and what you're designing things to. And honestly, just in the course of pulling together some information for this talk, it just became so clear what a lack of information there is in terms of, the discrete guidelines about designs and, how we should be updating our depth duration frequency or intensity duration frequency, so-called DDF and IDF curves. And so a colleague at Carnegie Mellon has actually recently done some really nice work to try to think about what are the best methods that we can use to take climate model downscaling information and put that into updated IDF and DDF curves to think about what is the new 25-year return period storm for 1 hour or 24-hour duration, or the whole gamut of different return periods and durations. And so this is just a snapshot specifically for cities spread across the US, the 25-year return period, and the teal triangles represent the 1-hour duration, the purple triangles, the 24-hour duration event. And basically the largest triangle there represents a 25 to 60% change from what's sort of the current historical magnitude of precipitation to what came from these downscaled climate model data. And so Pittsburgh is the city closest to us that's represented in this analysis. And you can see that for both the shorter duration and the 24-hour event, it's a pretty substantial increase that's anticipated. If we actually look at the, the whole suite of, different return periods here, we see on the left for the 1-hour duration and on the right for the 24-hour duration. Again, this is Pittsburgh, so similar, not exactly what we might see here in central Pennsylvania. And what's represented on these graphs is the black dotted line is the observed or sort of, current historical data, sort of, Atlas 14 NOAA information versus 3 different ways of basically taking downscale data and creating these updated DDF curves. And so the yellow, purple, and green are just different methods for doing that. But the overall trend that we see here is that precipitation depth is increasing and more so at higher return periods. So when you look up to the 50-year and the 100-year, we're seeing some pretty substantial increases. We also see greater uncertainty, but for the most part, those error bars on the lower side are still above the observed the observed pattern there. And so it's really something that's important to think about in terms of the fact that what was previously a rare event, we will be seeing that magnitude more frequently now. And we have to think about where that fits into our design standards and our design guidelines and our stormwater control strategies. And one other thing to mention is, I think one reason why there hasn't been a lot of updating of, IDF curves factoring in climate change is that it is challenging to decide on the appropriate sort of statistical method to use to, manage the uncertainty from the different climate models and to consider these shorter duration events. It's more challenging to, to be considering these, high intensity, short duration events and what will happen with those with respect to climate change. So what do we do? Well, the obvious thing, right, is design for higher capacity, but you all know, of course, that that's a challenge because of the financials. It's, we can't just say, okay, we'll just design for a bigger capacity because that costs a lot more money. And so, I pulled this language right from our BMP manual, noting how, it's not, we can't just decide to design everything for the 100-year event because, that's inherently a 1% probability of functioning at capacity in a given year. And so does it make sense to do that? But on the other hand, we can't just ignore the fact that we will be seeing these larger, more intense and more impactful in terms of the, the financial and the social and infrastructural impacts. So, I'm of course here to talk about solutions and, I'm not going to claim to have one perfect solution, but just throwing some ideas out there that I hope that you will consider. And I, of course, look forward to, having some discussion and some thoughts from you all after this. But, I just want to throw out there some key elements that I think are critical for to consider for thinking about how we can create resilience for a wide range of stormwater events, from these nuisance, more frequent events to these more extreme events. So some key principles, I think, are multifunctionality, and that's, of course, a big reason why a lot of us are thinking about green infrastructure to begin with, the idea that we can manage stormwater, but also get these other benefits or services. The question about whether we should be considering more distributed or centralized sort of strategies, the concepts of having redundancy or multiple features, and diversity or different types of features, and the concept of safe to fail. No engineer likes to talk about failure, but I will talk about what I really mean by this term in a little bit and how this plays into managing more extreme events. So in terms of leveraging functionality, again, this is a sort of a key element of green infrastructure. And on the left it is an example from where I used to live before coming to Pennsylvania. So in Arizona, they're dealing with these, pretty high intensity events that they can get, causing this pretty severe flash flooding at times. And so they really need to think about these larger events. And so a lot of the parks in the Phoenix metropolitan area often are also serving as overflow basins. And so it's serving for recreation the majority of the time, but is also explicitly engineered to serve as a stormwater overflow basin. On the right side is a basketball court and public square in Rotterdam that's been designed to both serve the public and also be a recreation space, but again, is also designed to also serve for stormwater detention. So it's kind of, thinking here, instead of, just thinking about green infrastructure where the primary focus is for stormwater management and you get these other benefits, when we think about these more extreme events, thinking about how we can leverage types of green infrastructure that are primarily designed for other functions, but in these larger events can also serve as serve a stormwater management purpose as well. We can also think about, down at the stream and opportunities for floodplain protection or restoration. I know there's been some discussion about some example projects in that realm. And here in State College, I've been working in our Walnut Springs Park here, where we have Walnut Run, a stream draining a highly urbanized, part of our borough, and it's very flashy. And so, having this park gives this stream the space to overbank safely, and in other times it's highly used for recreation. And there's also this constructed floodplain that wetland that was designed to give additional stormwater management during a whole range of events and water quality treatment as well. And obviously the logistics are challenging, right? That, this isn't always possible in various places, but it's something we need to think about in terms of where we can strategically make room for the stream or for the river to actually be able to safely overbank in larger events. In terms of this term, safe to fail, what I mean here is this idea that we can have infrastructure that is okay to flood in more extreme events. So this is, goes back to the example of the parks or the recreation spaces. So instead of just straight up preventing flooding from happening at all, it's focusing on minimizing the consequences of an extreme event, thinking about the areas of the landscape that are okay to flood and trying to really prevent flooding in, areas that it would be most, had the most severe impacts. Thinking about solutions, again, going back to the park example, of things that can also help and maintain social and ecosystem services, but also provide these stormwater management benefits. Thinking about decentralized systems rather than just, larger centralized solutions. And I'll have some examples of how that can make a difference in real systems during extreme events. And of course, the other sort of logistical challenge here is that a lot of this may require reaching across disciplinary boundaries and dealing with complex aspects of budgets and funding, but thinking about how we can kind of I don't know how I feel about this saying, but kill two birds with one stone, where we can try to, meet multiple goals and objectives at once. One example I wanted to throw out there is some really nice planning work that's come out of New York City. And I know, New York City is a huge metropolitan area compared to the municipalities that many of you are working for. But, I think there's some nice examples here in terms of some recent planning strategies that they have been going through. So they've actually been looking to Copenhagen, Denmark, that's been a leader in what people are referring to as cloudburst planning. So the idea of these sort of cloudburst, really high intensity events that can create widespread nuisance flooding. And so, New York City commissioned this cloudburst resiliency planning study that was recently completed, where some of the key questions are presented here. And I encourage you to check out the executive summary on this if you're curious about it. There's some really, really nice graphics in there, and I'll just show a few of them. But some of the questions they had were, looking to the middle one, the fundamental idea was thinking about going from, the return period of 5 years to thinking about, managing the impacts of some of these more extreme events, and how could they create add a buffer using blue-green infrastructure specifically. So that's what the BGI refers to, thinking of blue being more like ponds versus green infrastructure. How can they also create greater urban value and co-benefits for capital investments? And is it possible through this planning process to create increased cooperation through city agencies? So they're calling out, their DEP, parks, and DOT, and their housing authority as well. So they were also trying to think about, equity questions as well. So in terms of the sort of strategies they're thinking about, a whole suite of different types of strategies, but then also how to sort of strategically connect and choose these locations. So they're thinking about some, centralized, larger retention and storage ponds, but also, where, certain roads could be designed to convey water, where there could be what they call retention streets that are designed with substantial, infiltration trenches and other green infrastructure features, where there could be more localized retention related to, buildings and impervious surfaces, and where there could be increased sizing of their stormwater pipes, what they called cloudburst pipes. And on the right, you can see how they're really thinking about, the strategic sort of layout of all these features, and this was all fed into some H&H modeling to look at, how the actual how this would actually manifest in terms of the sort of nuisance flooding impacts around the city. So I'm glazing over a lot of the details, but the ultimate goal was to do a cost-benefit analysis here, and they ultimately found that even though there is substantial investment costs, that the avoided risk costs, the avoided social costs, and the created environmental and social values all made it for a much greater net present value, and it was a ratio of 1.8 basically to the invested funds. So it was a pretty substantial increase in value from the creation of this blue-green infrastructure. And this is all still a planning exercise, but they are working on some pilot implementation as well in selected neighborhoods. So another thing I wanted to talk about is, what do we actually know in terms of evidence-wise about how green infrastructure actually functions in extreme events? And I'll say that there's not actually a lot of documented evidence. I'm sure there's kind of a lot of anecdotal observations that, is maybe kind of hard to track down in some of your guys' heads. But in terms of, trying to find some field data collection, there's some nice examples from New York City and Philadelphia of performance of some infiltration-based green infrastructure. So in both of these cases, there was hydrologic monitoring of these facilities happening during some major storms, either Hurricane Irene or Superstorm Sandy. So in the case of the New York City one, this was a bioinfiltration swale. And one thing to note was they found that the efficiency of water actually entering through the inlet decreased quite a bit. So something to think about in terms of just considering better design of inlets to actually get more of that water in there. They found that there was a lot more bypass during extreme events. And amazingly enough, though, there was only one overflow event in the time period that they were doing monitoring, which I think was over the course of a couple years. They captured 14 extreme, or I think that was considered 95th percentile event, and 78 non-extreme events, and there was only one single period of overflow, and that was during Hurricane Irene, which was a pretty, classified as a pretty high return period event. In Philadelphia, there has been some long-term monitoring in a particular infiltration trench that's part of a larger treatment train. And in this case, 20 out of 159 events produced overflow, with 89% of those being greater than the design storm. but overflow is always very brief. So 97 to 99% of runoff was actually still retained in Superstorm Sandy. So this kind of goes to the idea that we can, even if we're not designing for full capacity for an extreme event, we're kind of cutting off, we're still like cutting off a large part of that impact by, managing what we are. And 93% of the runoff retained for all events exceeded that were exceeding the design storm. And so overall, there was pretty good performance, better performance than you would anticipate just based on the design standard. And why that was is really the ability to infiltrate and retain in these features. And so it's not something that's well considered in our current, recommendations for how we're designing to a certain capacity. We're really mostly thinking about surface storage and not really thinking as much about continuous infiltration capacity. And so that's where, infiltration focused green infrastructure can really lead to, overall better performance, depending on how precisely we're designing them. And so this is where not just having detention focused infrastructure is really critical. Just one other example from the watershed scale, the USGS has been supporting monitoring in a couple watersheds in Virginia and Maryland that have very different sort of different spatial organization of development, as well as different types of stormwater controls. And it's obviously logistically always tough to come up with these watershed scale comparisons that are meaningful, but they managed to set it up by partnering with some local county folks, and that was awesome for them to get this really great data set. And so they were able to compare watersheds that were otherwise pretty similar in terms of climate and geology and those sort of existing factors. And so they had a essentially fully forested watershed, and then 3 watersheds that were more developed. And so one had more distributed green infrastructure of various sorts, rain gardens, infiltration trenches distributed throughout the catchment. One that really focused on, just a few very large centralized sort of detention ponds. And then another one that had more centralized stormwater controls, but also really tried to cluster the development and leave existing intact, forested or otherwise natural spaces. And that's that bottom right one, the Cent Virginia watershed. So on the right, they ended up monitoring during Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Irene. And so we're able to see the resulting performance at the watershed outlets across this extreme event that was essentially, around a 1,000-year return period. And, so overall, it was, so it's hard to see that legend. It's down in panel C. The light blue is actually that centralized stormwater control watershed in Virginia that had really strategically clustered development. And so that one was actually best performing in terms of the lowest peaks and the most runoff reduction. So it really goes to show that just the spatial strategizing of development can make a big impact and leveraging, intact natural space. But then the distributed stormwater control watershed also performed really well as well. And it was the, watershed with widespread, impervious cover and just larger centralized stormwater controls that really performed the worst in terms of the highest peaks, the sharpest peaks, and the least, the most runoff coming off. So just bringing this all together, with these, the information coming out of climate models, it's clear that we need to be considering updated depth duration frequency and intensity duration frequency curves, and thinking about how our design guidelines should be changing. Should we just be updating our current design storm to what that, amount should be? Should we be changing that design storm at all? And then what are the appropriate strategies to be implementing that can help create more resilience, just based on their organization and the type of features that they are. So thinking about a diverse mix of strategies distributed around the watershed, as well as really trying to leverage infiltration-based infrastructure wherever we can, and really thinking about where there is appropriate, where we can sort of create these safe to fail features per se that can serve as, stormwater control features in these larger events, but serve other purposes for, much of the rest of the time. So that was all I wanted to say. Hopefully this was helpful, and you probably have a lot of questions. And the thing that I would love to hear from you guys is, it's a tough topic, and I'm sure that there are a lot of barriers and hurdles that you envision in managing extreme events. And so I would love to hear some more discussion on that point.
Thanks, Lauren. It is a really interesting and timely topic. There are some questions for you in the chat. The first one is, who would update the DFF IDF curves? Is that NOAA's responsibility?
That is a good question, and perhaps that's not why it's happening. I mean, I think that no one has kind of stepped up to the plate. I would say that because NOAA is kind of the main, they are the repository for all of our national weather data, and there's other federal agencies that are running a lot of these major climate models. I would say that federal agency leadership is what we should see more of, but I think there's also a place for our state to be kind of taking some of the guidance that's coming out on appropriate ways to take down scale data and create updated curves, and having this discussion. And perhaps that discussion is being had behind closed doors about what to do about this. But I think that's part of the challenge, is no one really wants to deal with it. And so far that information is not getting out there, but it's not an acceptable solution to just ignore that it's happening.
Oh, I see some more questions. Let's see. So this is sort of a comment with a question. Irene Lee did highlight the need in my area for extreme event management and weaknesses in the system. Army Corps of Engineers has done some flood studies in the Hershey area to address massive flooding there that we have been able to build on in our planning. How do we do this more proactively instead of reactively?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the challenge, right? It's hard to convince people to spend the money to, plan ahead. And then when that prevents, an event like, serious impacts, it's like, well, nothing happened. And, people don't really notice that as much, whereas the event happens and you're like, oh, shoot, okay, now we need to react to it. So it's always the challenge with like, you make the fix and then the bad thing doesn't happen, and people aren't often recognizing that prevention actually occurred. So yeah, I don't know, that it's a wicked problem, right? And I think there is more effort going, as like, different levels of municipalities and are going through different sort of strategic planning processes. I think there is some consideration of how can we start thinking about these different challenges, but it's of course like where can we get the funds to support some of this process, both the planning and the implementation. And yeah, I don't know that I have the great solution there.
All right, there's some more comments popping up here for you. I mean, I think it is a discussion, and if some folks want to take their mic off of mute, so it's less of a Q&A and maybe more of a discussion. But another comment came in from Ellen. We've seen a lot of reliance on stream bank restoration projects in the PRPs in Pennsylvania, and this reflects MS4 permits focus on sediment. Would it be accurate to say that an over-reliance on stream bank restoration may be a risky strategy for larger storms because it's not a multifunctional practice? It's not distributed or diverse. For example, one stream bank restoration versus several smaller BMPs, and not really in a safe to fail element in stream bank restoration.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's definitely something that's concerned me a little bit as I've seen kind of the extreme enthusiasm for reaching those sediment goals based on the crediting for stream restoration. And, obviously there's different types of stream restoration, and some are inherently thinking about, leveraging the floodplain and regrading the floodplain as well. But I do think that just relying on stream restoration and not thinking about more up in the watershed, not thinking about the floodplain as part of that process all the time are both weaknesses. And, if we're just restoring the stream and not dealing with, development that happened pre-stormwater control guidelines, then we are setting ourselves up for some sort of failure at some level.
And I feel like that discussion is happening in the Chesapeake Bay and looking at like their crediting, they're looking at, okay, we're doing all this work in the stream, but if we're not controlling those upstream sources, then is what we're investing in the stream corridor going to be sustainable and, long-term resilient? For the safe to fail idea, do you have experience or thoughts on, selecting those sites and involving the community? Community could be in an uproar if their park is flooding on a regular basis. And so, because you talked about the social component of it too. So do you have thoughts on sort of how those sites get selected?
Yeah, 100% there has to be, community engagement at multiple points and education about, that it is a site that is, meant to flood in certain times. And I guess, being in, it's maybe something that, you're gradually adding these features in and you're taking that extra effort to make sure that there is appropriate signage and, community involvement and ways to get out the message in multiple ways. I think in Arizona, it was like, it was kind of accepted and pretty common to see that happening. And there was signage in some areas, but it was like on a rainy day, you just saw that the park was basically acting as a retention basin. And it was just kind of what people anticipated would happen.
Well, and I think the concept that you mentioned with the cloudburst planning in the retention streets, like streets that are intentionally designed to take on that additional flow. Are we talking about streets that actually will be intended and planned to close during these events to take the pressure off of other streets?
Essentially, yeah. And this definitely requires a change of mindset, right? And nobody likes change, and it's going to be like a tough process, but nobody also likes just having streets that are flooded that you didn't realize were going to be flooded either, and then you got to turn around, or you have issues where rescues need to happen because they drove into it. And so, even though there are some steps that need to happen to, implement that and to make people aware that that is the way that things are now, I would like to think that the ultimate solution is better, because that street is something that's designed like that. And if there is a heavy rain, you just can't go down that, instead of the spots that like maybe it'll flood, maybe it won't, the sort of low-lying streets. I guess there is the signage on a lot of those, right? Like warning, the street tends to flood during an event, but really deliberately planning for that is, an even sort of better step.
Right. I think the outreach component that you mentioned and just changing people's mindsets. It's this idea of, putting snow tires on and driving at a slower speed than as opposed to putting salt on every single road. It's just
Exactly.
we've got to change the level of service expectations that we have in our cities based on environmental protection and resiliency. I don't see any other questions in the chat for Lauren. I don't know if that means that folks are absorbing information. It's infiltrating, to use a stormwater analogy. But I think this was really fascinating. Lauren, one thing I wanted to ask you, do you think cloudburst planning is inherently different than this idea of, climate resiliency and that sort of planning? Is it just terminology, or is there inherently a difference in that approach?
Yeah, I guess, the cloudburst term is really thinking explicitly about those really high intensity short events that can cause widespread nuisance flooding. But, I think climate resiliency captures that, but also broader issues. There's different sorts of precipitation changes happening. There's even some drought changes. And of course, there's the heat changes. So there's like a really widespread range of things we have to think about. We're going to be having less snow in the winter and more rain and ice. And that means that we'll have more road salt going into our green infrastructure. We have to pick the right plants for that also are resilient to the drought. There's like many. That's, I think, the more complex sort of resiliency to think about, because it's very multifaceted.
Okay, so cloudburst planning would come under the umbrella of climate resiliency.
Yeah.
Use another stormwater metaphor. Great. Well, this was fascinating. Everyone, if you can show Lauren some appreciation using your applause emojis, and thank you for your time today to give us new things to think about, new things to watch for, as this topic of stormwater management becomes more complicated and complex in our ever-changing climate environment. Thanks for your time today. Make sure, folks, that you hit the leave button and join us back in the plenary for our next sessions. Thanks so much, Lauren. This was great.
Yep. Thank you.